70% of small and medium-sized business successions will fail. This is 60 to 70%. This is according to leading research out of Harvard, out of the University of North Carolina, the Family Business Institute. The reasons are simple. First, most businesses don't prepare for succession. They just don't even prepare for it, so it doesn't work out at all for them. Second, when they do prepare, those who do, they tend to only focus on replacing the exiting leader. To only focus on replacing the exiting leader is a little bit like saying all that you need for a successful heart transplant is to find the perfect new heart. Now, that's silly. Nobody would do that for, needing to replace a heart, but it is how succession planning, for those who do it at all, usually approach it. We just need to replace the senior leader. But in reality, succession is a complex event. It's a systemic event. It impacts the entire organization. Identifying the new leader is only part of a successful process, and it's usually the last part that you need to focus on. That's a surprise for most people. So I've covered in previous videos the first two steps that I think you should take before you even think about preparing for an exiting leader. The first one is emergency succession planning. That's how to prepare for an unplanned departure. And staff succession planning, which is how to build your bench strength and avoid being caught short when key people move, whether or not it's the executive that's moving. So if you haven't seen those yet, I'd recommend starting here. You'll find links for those below. But today, we're going to look at the third piece, executive succession planning done right. And this is the kind of plan most people have in mind when they're thinking about or asking about succession planning. They're thinking about how do we replace the executive. I'm going to explain it to you, but I'm going to explain it in a way that's a little more holistic than what most people think about, which is why this process actually works. All right, so looking at or thinking about executive succession, one of the key points I want to point out here, because people confuse it a little bit, which is succession planning and exit planning are related but not quite the same thing. With succession planning, we're talking about replacing a leader, but not necessarily ownership. With exit planning, we're usually talking about replacing an owner, maybe or maybe not the leader, or at least ownership, maybe or maybe not the person themselves. Those are subtle differences, but they actually have a pretty big impact in the approach that you're taking. So if you're here to learn about leadership change and what happens in that dynamic, then this will help you. All of this is also useful in scenarios when there's ownership changes, but as you'll see, there's a differing level of control that you have if ownership's about to change. So some of this won't easily apply. So I want to talk about some of the reasons that executive successions tend to fail. I mentioned 70%, it's about 60 to 70% of the successions, depending on what study you read, fail. And by failure, we're meaning legitimate failure, like the company shuts down. That's the worst case scenario. Or there's a loss of control. Let's say you're a family-owned company and somehow you lose control of it and someone else takes ownership of it. Most often what you're likely to see is a loss in performance in the company, of share value. If you're a company that is a C corporation, you're publicly owned in some way, and that matters for what you're doing. But for most companies, you just see a drop in performance. Oftentimes that's associated with a transition in key or important staff, and that also creates this drop in performance. The last two things is often, and they're related, is oftentimes there might be a conflict between the incoming leader and the board or whoever provides governance for the organization or ownership of the organization. And somehow, one way or another, the leadership or the ownership of the organization or the board says this was a mistake, we shouldn't hire that person. Another little fun fact, I'm going to try to depress you as much as I can before we get in, but I really want you to understand that this is a high stakes decision and a high stakes scenario. The failure rate is very high, but this is not deterministic. There's no fate out there that's going to make it likely that you fail. If you follow the process that I give you, the chances are high that you'll have a very successful transition event. It's when people skip these steps and they haven't really thought it through, they're not really aware of how big of a topic executive leadership transitions really are, and they underestimate the impact of them, that's when they run into problems. But one other key fact that I want to put out there that's important for you to be aware of, and this factors into the failure amount, is that for most new CEOs, this is someone you hire from the outside, someone that you promote from within, the majority, just over 50%, will actually leave their role within 18 months. So most of them don't fit into that well. So you've got someone who's leaving, you found your successor, the person who's going to come into that role. There's a high percentage of the time that that person's not going to be around 2 or 3 years from now. And within that amount of time, there may be all kinds of euphemisms or reasons for why they move on. But what everybody knows is that didn't really work out that well. So we're going to talk about how do you try to mitigate that? How do you try to avoid all of that? Here's some common failure points. The most common one is that the outgoing leader is the one who chooses their own successor. Sometimes they just take it upon themselves to do that and they groom somebody. Sometimes they're tasked with doing that by whoever provides governance for the organization. They're asked, go find your successor, fill your seat. It's very, very common. I would say 80–90% of the time I see this scenario happen. It's the wrong thing to do. Whoever provides governance, the ownership team, the board, you are responsible for choosing the successor. That's your one employee, depending on how you're structured, or your one director, or whoever's running it. That's the person who reports to you. They're not reporting, in most cases, reporting to the outgoing leader who's just leaving the organization. They're reporting to you. So you need to find somebody who's a good partner with you in running this organization. I'm not going to go into it now, but there are all kinds of biases that the outgoing leader tends to bring to bear, and it causes them to choose the wrong person, essentially, somebody who's not the best fit for the job, or they don't prepare them well for various reasons. There's a lot of really interesting psychology behind it, but I mean, just as an example, oftentimes they'll choose somebody who's been a fantastic, loyal lieutenant and has been a great, to use language that some people are using, they've been a great implementer for years, and they bring them in because this person understands things, they understand the culture, they're going to keep what I've built, they're going to protect my legacy, and I'm going to bring them in. But that person who comes in struggles with vision, struggles with executive position, and being able to be appropriately directive and provide that kind of drive and accountability. It's a different personality. And it's not that they can't grow into that role, but for many people, it's an uncomfortable fit. That's just one very common scenario. Another failure point is bringing in a new leader who sounds good, their resume sounds good, but they're not a fit with your culture, they're not a fit with your vision, they're not a fit with your values, they just don't fit you. They're a fantastic person, they're maybe a high flyer, but they don't fit in your world. And that wasn't apparent oftentimes because you haven't really defined or have a good grasp on what is our world, what are our values, what is our vision, what is our culture, and how do we even know if somebody's a good fit for it? The third thing is transitions often drag on. This is very common. This happens all the time. Somebody says, "Hey, I'm gonna retire when I'm 62." They turn 62. They look around them. Typically, whoever's providing governance isn't that involved in the conversation, and they say, "I'm trying to get somebody ready, but they're not quite ready yet. I was going to retire, in March, but maybe it's September." And it'll drift on for another 6 months. Maybe they find somebody now, like, okay, you're the person who's going to step in for me, but I'm not sure if you're ready yet. And part of what they're thinking is, I'm not really ready to go either. I'm realizing I don't know what to do. I'm not sure really what my future is going to be. I've still got some energy. My wife doesn't want me hanging out at home all the time. And so they stick around for an undefined amount of time. And that creates a lot of frustration. It can generate friction between themselves and the heir apparent, the successor, because that successor doesn't know how to gear up. For the entire team that's reading and trying to understand who do we need to begin aligning ourselves towards, it can become very confusing because they're trying to understand who's the leader of this and when do we start shifting our alignments. And so what I recommend is that you don't want to have a rigid rule around this because there's scenarios that come up that require different approaches. But I recommend having a clear deadline, like, okay, at the end of June next year, that's when I'm out. And so we want to begin transitioning the other person in as of January 1 of that year, or whatever the time frame is. And then you really stick to it because without doing that, it tends to create a lot of uncertainty and confusion within the organization. Outgoing leaders often are not aware of the level that creates tension and kind of sucks energy out of the organization. Additionally, another reason that a lot of these successions fail is because you get staff turnover that people don't anticipate. The executive leaves, they want to bring in a new team, people do or don't mesh with them, with the new leader, and there's this transition. And within the first 6 months to the first year, up to 18 months, there's usually some fairly significant transition most of the time, and it's usually unanticipated. And because of that, you spend all sorts of time just trying to get a team in place, not moving forward towards the vision of the organization. So let's talk about the 7 steps that I recommend for doing executive succession right. And I think what you should see in this is that this is a little bit more comprehensive. It starts a little further upriver than you might be thinking. And it actually helps you build a much more robust, intentional, resilient organization than just purely finding. It's not just a staffing decision. I think you'll see that here in a second. So the first thing that I recommend doing is that you form a search committee. It's okay if this is the second thing, but you want to do this very early. And this should usually be formed out of primarily the ownership or the governance of the organization. You want the people who are in charge of the organization ultimately, who have a vested interest in the future of it, to be part of this search committee. I'd recommend, maybe 3 to 5 people. It shouldn't be a huge committee. You can have key employees as part of it, but you want it to be anchored in the folks who have the key shareholders or the key governance providers for the organization. The outgoing leader should not be part of this committee. They can be consulted by the committee, and they should be. They can provide some advice to the committee, and that should happen, but they shouldn't be on the committee. These are the folks who are going to make the recommendations, or in some organizations make the decision about who the new leader is going to be, and it should be the people who are going to live with that choice into the future, not somebody who's leaving. The second thing is support the outgoing leader. And by this I mean 2 specific things. One is personal support. In my experience, about 85%, it's that frequent, 85% of outgoing leaders who are planning their succession will somehow start to stall or sabotage their retirement or their transition out. It happens the vast majority of the time. It's so frequent that that's the scenario that I anticipate and plan for, because it's the most likely one to happen. And there's 2 reasons for it. One is they haven't really defined their personal goals for afterwards. They don't have a good sense of what their life is going to be afterwards. They know that they're tired right now, they're burned out with aspects of their job, whatever they're thinking, but they often will say things. I mean, the most common things I hear is, I want to hang out with the grandkids, I want to play golf, I want to be on my sailboat. I hear those all the time. And or I'm going to travel. My wife has been wanting to travel, and we're going to travel. But the reality is none of those, for most people, will actually take up 40 hours a week. The most common response when I talk to an outgoing leader about preparing for the future is pushback. They will insist, I don't need to do that. I went on a vacation once, we had 2 weeks, and we just did nothing, and it was great, and I could spend the rest of my life doing that. Probably not, especially if you're an entrepreneur. You've got drive, you've got energy, you have creativity. You have to find a place to put that creativity and drive. So one of the first things I would recommend that the search committee or the board does is that they support the outgoing leader, even if it's hiring them a life coach or a counselor or somebody that they can talk through to help them build out. What are you going to do? You're retiring at 65. You've got decades ahead of you. What are you going to do with that time? And map that out. They need to have, here's the key, they need to have something, and if you're the outgoing leader, you need to have something that's compelling, and it's pulling you that you can't wait to go do that part of your life. You can't wait to enter that. Otherwise, what happens is if it's vague stuff like I want to hang out with the grandkids a bit, what's going to happen is as the dates start to line up for you to move out, it's going to feel like pressure, like you're getting pushed out. And most leaders in this role don't like to get pushed, and they'll push back. And so, as I said, 85% of the time, I see this dynamic. The second thing is you want to help them prepare financially. Now, this might sound strange to you. You may think they've been paid well. What do we need to do to prepare them? What I would say is within about 2 to 3 years of before them heading out, I would encourage that you ensure or line them up with a good financial planner or wealth manager. If they don't already have one in place, they should have one, and they should have a good plan. Because what frequently happens is you get people who are high earners, but they haven't really thought through what is my life afterwards going to cost. And when they do the math, which is often very late in the game, 3 months before they're supposed to retire, they do the math and they realize I might be coming up a little bit short. I feel some anxiety around this. I feel some nervousness around this, and they hit the brakes. So all of this is foreseeable. If you know what life is going to look like afterwards, and you know what it costs to make that life work, then you want to use some time to make sure you're prepared for that. It is worth it to the ownership team or to the governance board to pay even just for a planning session. Put down $5,000 or whatever your planner costs to sit down and walk them through a plan if they don't already have one. At a minimum, I would just ask, what is your personal plan, and have you mapped this out with somebody? Do you have a planner that you're working with? If they don't, strongly encourage them to do that. Otherwise, they tend to hit the brakes. You probably didn't expect that as part of succession planning, but in my experience, very few, very, very smart, brilliant, hard-driving, strategic thinking, visionary executives think this part out as well as you would anticipate that they would. They often don't. And so you want to make sure that they do so they don't hit the brakes and undermine the success of the succession plan. The second thing that you want to do is clarify the values and vision of the organization. You want to make sure that you understand your values. Your values are the drivers of how you make decisions and how you behave towards each other, and they should be commonly held within the organization and taught and integrated throughout your organization. And your vision is where you want to go. And then you hire somebody who can get you to here and makes decisions and behaves already in alignment with your values. If you know what these are, and as an ownership team or a board, you have agreement on this is where we're trying to go and this is really who we are, then it makes it so much easier to recognize when you found the right fit, whether you're recruiting from inside or you're hiring from outside. If you don't have this, it becomes very, very murky. Huge mistake that lots of organizations make is we don't have this without our senior leader because the last person is the one who provided it. So we're going to hire somebody who's going to provide a vision for us. The chances are very high that their sense of vision or direction, assuming they're good at coming up with one at all, isn't going to be completely in alignment with yours or with your team's. And because it's so high, again, I want to go back to the statistics that I mentioned earlier, 60 to 70% fail. The majority of new CEOs will be out in 18 months. And it's often because there's a lack of really solid alignment in these areas. So you want to spend time making sure you know who are we and what are we trying to accomplish as an organization, and then who will be the leader that will get us there and that will best model and champion these values. If you know that, then your recruitment process, your hiring process, your evaluation process, your relationship with that person afterwards, it's going to be dramatically better. All right. The fourth point is to define future leadership structure. This means what's the structure, the organizational chart. If you watch the video on staff succession, that explains how to do that. If you go to my Succession360 links that are at the bottom, there's a toolkit that has a do-it-yourself guide for how to do these things. But you want to define the future leadership structure that is going to be required by this vision. So if part of your vision is you want to double the company within the next 3 years, you're going to have staff changes. You're going to need a different kind of leadership team. Maybe some of the people will stay. Maybe some of the people will move in their positions. Maybe some people are going to need to be trained. Either way, you want to define that first. This is always a little bit guesswork, but you want to try to do the guessing. Define this future leadership structure because it tells you who is this person going to lead. So before you even go out and try to find the person, you know where we're trying to go, you know how we do business, and now you know who are they going to be leading, who are they going to be working with, what's the right kind of person for that. Here's why this is important, because most of the time when succession happens, most people default to thinking, how do we replace the outgoing leader? The outgoing leader has not yet built this vision. They may or may not be the person who could build that vision. And so you don't want to just try to, you can't replace that person like apple to apple. It's not possible. But even if you could, it still might be the wrong person to get you to here. And so you need to know what's the future leadership structure. This may feel like an unnecessary step, but trust me that if you take the time to think, and this is like a 20-minute, 30-minute, 45-minute exercise is not a big deal. But if you take some time to think it through, you'll find that all of a sudden you have all kinds of important data at your fingertips that's going to help you with some of the next steps. The next thing that you want to do, I might run out of room here on the board, is stabilize before the transition. And what I mean here is take a look at your company and see, are there any soap operas going on? Are there any major staff disputes happening? Are there lawsuits? Are there any unresolved issues? Is the boat rocking really hard right now? And we'd be bringing the successor into a group of problems that they may not be totally equipped to handle or not aware of. As much as you can, what you should do with the outgoing leader is, I would say in the year to 2 years before they leave, they should probably start to dial back on most major strategic initiatives, unless they've already been identified by the board as this is where we want to go. But any of their pet projects, they should get all of that wrapped up. The outgoing leaders' pet projects, any kind of conflict, any kind of issues, you want to, as much as possible, as much as is reasonable, stabilize those so that there's just less rockiness, less movement going on when the new leader comes in. This improves the likelihood of success coming in. Now here, almost at the end, you select the successor. Whoops. Am I spelling that right? I think so. 2 R's. All right. Select the successor right at the end. Usually in this process here, once you know the values and the vision, you know what they're going to be leading, you have now developed a strong sense of who is the kind of person, what are the qualities that they need to have to be able to lead us where we're going to go. If you can't stabilize everything, you now have a sense of, okay, what capacity does this person need to be able to have to walk into maybe a not entirely stable or structured or peaceful environment? What skill mix are they going to need to have to be successful in that space? Based off of that, you select your successor. There's a lot of different ways to do that. It's not always the best way, but I'm a big proponent of working with a good recruiting firm and even having internal prospects or internal candidates, I should say, for this position apply along with external candidates. Because oftentimes, especially organizations that don't do a lot of executive succession, they have a hard time imagining that anybody could be this, especially if the outgoing leader was a loved person. They have a hard time imagining anyone could be as good as that person. And it's helpful to cast a wider net and just see who's out there, because oftentimes people are surprised at like, oh, there's some really amazing qualified people out there who want to work with us. It's worth looking at that. I'm not going to do a deep dive into how to select them other than these two, point number 3 and point number 4, tell you what to look for. And if you know what to look for, recognizing if you already have this person on staff becomes very easy. And if you need to recruit outside, being able to define what you're looking for and being able to recognize them when they come in also becomes easier. And it makes the process much faster and much simpler. Last, onboard and transition. And I go into a lot more detail on all of these in the Succession360 Toolkit documents, so download all of those. But you want to bring in the new successor and give them enough time to get familiar with the company, with the organization if they're coming in from outside, even if they're being promoted. I cannot tell you how often somebody who is COO or CFO gets promoted to CEO. All along, they've been thinking, if I had that job, I could do it right, and I know how to do that already. I'm around this stuff all the time. And then they get in the role, and they're like, this is a different job than what I thought. That's the norm. That happens most of the time. And so you want to give them some time to get onboarded into the kinds of decisions that people at the CEO level are making, which are often the level of strategy involved, but really it's the interpersonal dynamics and the emotional side of it. Honestly, that catches most people by surprise, is that, oh, this is, yeah, on a socio-emotional level, it's more challenging than what people anticipate. It's really not the strategy and the tactics of leadership. Those are usually, honestly, the easier things. Not that they're always easy, but they're usually easier. It's the people stuff. That's the work. And the higher you go in an organization, the more your job is people stuff. So onboarding and transitioning, giving this person a time to build relationships, to build trust. I have a book called The Successful New CEO, and it describes how this person should enter in and start to build those relationships so they can quickly get up to speed. And so I would recommend taking a look at that. But these are basically the 7 steps for how to do a solid, effective executive transition. So when you get this right, it creates harmony in the organization and it creates certainty. There's remember, 60 to 70% of these successions are not likely to go right. And so that rockiness that most of these organizations experience are felt by the staff. They're felt by your customers oftentimes. They're felt by your partners or your vendors in the community. And so they're felt by a lot of people. And that instability is not positive. When you have planned these things out and you've done this kind of work, your staff will feel it. They'll have been feeling it on the way up. And it gives them more confidence and less uncertainty, which helps reduce the number of staff who actually end up leaving and departing. Additionally, the same thing with your customers, with partners, with vendors. They just realize, okay, you're still a stable partner for us to work with. You're planning things in advance. You've thought this stuff through, and it just gives them confidence, which in business is a big deal. Executive succession planning protects your company from disruption, and it positions it for long-term success. But remember, as I said earlier, this is only one part of a complete succession plan. That's why I created the Succession360 process. It includes 3 pieces: emergency succession, staff succession, and executive succession. Each one builds on the other one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to watch the emergency succession and staff succession videos. You'll find the links for those below. And together, all 3 of these will give you a complete framework that you need for a smooth and successful leadership transition. It'll also help you build a much more resilient and robust company overall.